Hi, everyone. Welcome to our August Book Club Favorites event, where we'll be discussing Megan Miranda's newest novel, The Last to Vanish. We are joined today by Megan Miranda, the New York Times bestselling author of All the Missing Girls, The Perfect Stranger, The Last House Guest, and Such a Quiet Place. We're also joined by our publicity pro, Claire Maurer, and our awesome publishing and marketing genius, Brianna Yamashita, to help lead the conversation. Before we get into our discussion, I want to let everyone watching know that 3 lucky viewers could win a copy of The Last to Vanish. To enter for your chance to win, just leave a question for us in the comment section of this video, and we will do our best to answer as many questions as possible live on screen today. And now on to book club. Claire and Brianna, I'll let you take it away.
Yes, thank you, Colleen. Megan, thank you so much for joining us today. We are all so thrilled to be talking about this glorious, glorious book, The Last to Vanish. Could you start by maybe telling everyone a little bit about the inspiration for the novel?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks so much for having me. The Last to Vanish is about this small mountain town with a very mysterious history. So, over the course of 25 years, 7 visitors to the area have vanished without a trace. Most recently, a journalist who was investigating this string of disappearances. And as the local sheriff says, this is like very bad optics at this point. So, I kind of had 2 different inspiration points for it. The first was for the town itself. I live in North Carolina, and my kids go on class trips to Charleston, South Carolina, a lot. And they go on these historical ghost tours and come home and tell me about it. And I became really interested in an idea of a place that had this kind of like ghost tour history that you could learn about. But what if that history was not something that happened in the very distant past, but instead was something that was almost something that was still happening? And what would a place like that look like? And so a place that does not try to hide from this history, but instead really embrace it. Like, yes, we are the place where 7 people were last seen. And this is not a deterrent, but you should come visit and see if you can uncover it. And then the other place of inspiration was actually when I was on a walk myself in my neighborhood. It had just stopped raining, and we have this series of trails that connect the area. And I had just stepped into this tree line into the trail, and it sounded like it was still raining, even though it had stopped. You could hear the water falling from the trees still. And it's the first time I got a sense of my main character's voice and her vision of this place where it sounded like the past was still happening. And that I took out my phone right then and just started writing this scene of how she was viewing this place and how it felt like by the time you were seeing something, it had already happened and it was too late. And that became a paragraph at the end of chapter 2. So I love that it kind of remained as part of the story.
That's great. And I know that you put together some of like the best twist endings, I have to say. I've read many mysteries, and a lot of people always wonder, like, how do you plot out this book, and do you know that going in what you're going to throw in as a twist, or without any spoilers, do you think you can explain that process?
Yes. I actually know nothing when I start my book. I'm very jealous of writers who can see the entire plot from the beginning. And I've come to embrace that this is just my process. And I actually kind of like that because I write from my main character's point of view. I write in first person, and she doesn't know who to trust, and neither do I. So I go into that where I feel like I can really connect to that uncertainty and that point of view. And so my first drafts are very much discovery drafts. Because of that, there's a lot of kind of trial and error and figuring things out along the way. I like to let the character lead the way. And I feel like I don't know those plot turning points until I get a sense of what their relationships are like. And so what I try to do when I'm starting is if I can see kind of the shift in perspective that happens by 50 to 100 pages, then I feel like I can write my way into that world if I can kind of see that as a guidepost. And then once I get there, if I can see kind of the 50% big shift either to the narrator or to the reader, then I can write my way there. And then hopefully when I reach the middle, I know the ending, but that's not always the case. But I will say, I feel like I outline as I go because I create these spreadsheets. I use Excel to map things out as I'm going. And so as I'm writing, I have different columns. Some of it's just like the summary, and some of it is kind of clues that I'm placing and hope that they become relevant later on, and how can I use them. And then I will also have what I call turning points or reveals. And those are things that either change the narrator's view of something or change the reader's view of something. And so by the time I get to the end, I do have this very detailed outline, but it's something I develop as I'm writing that first draft and then use a lot when I'm revising.
Great. And Cutter's Pass, the setting for this book, it is almost a character in itself with how atmospheric and real this town feels. Joelle asks, is it based on a particular town in North Carolina?
Ooh, so that's a great question. So I love small towns, and I love writing about small towns. And because I also love living in small towns, I like to make my towns completely up, because inevitably when you're writing a thriller, you're taking someone's lovely small town and being like, how can I turn this really, really creepy, and expose all these like secrets that are buried under the surface. So it is a completely fictional place. But when I was writing the book, I did take several trips to the mountains in North Carolina to try and really channel that feeling. And I love the mountains of North Carolina. So I would say it's kind of a cross between two places. One is Bryson City, which is, very outdoorsy. They have like a big river rafting center, and I have been there in the past with my family. And then when I was researching this book, I went to this town called Hot Springs, North Carolina. And it's so unique. It's this tiny little beautiful town. And the Appalachian Trail cuts right through the center of it. So there's actually a trail marker on the sidewalk that you walk past as you're doing these hikes. So I'd say it's kind of a cross between those two, but it's also completely fictionalized. And, I try to embrace this idea that every place is a character, and every character has a different relationship with this place. And it can be both like the most beautiful place in the world, but also the most terrifying, just based on what's happening in that moment.
And we have a viewer who's asking how you come up with ideas for your books. I mean, as a thriller writer, you're probably going in all these different situations. I mean, your imagination is maybe a little overactive. Are there moments and things like what kind of inspires you when you're, going about your daily life?
It is. I do think, so much of it comes down to the overactive imagination. And I think so much of thrillers is you take this like little event or this little thought, and then you push it to an extreme. And so that's really what I try and do, is I take these little, inspiration points, and then really try to like see how extreme they could go, and follow it down that path. And a lot of times ideas combine, and that's when they become a book. So at first, I feel like a little idea might give an inspiration for the town, and then it will merge with something else. So for example, for Such a Quiet Place, I'd for a long time been interested in telling like a neighborhood story. Like, I'm gonna pull those boundaries even tighter and set a mystery within the confines of a neighborhood. And then I was watching some true crime, and at the end I was like, I wonder what happens next, like after you think the mystery is done. And they kind of combined, where suddenly I was like, I have the right idea for this story. It's in the aftermath of a crime instead. So that's often how it happens, is these ideas kind of sit in the back of my mind, and then they pull together in this like, aha, now you have a book idea moment.
And Megan, you started your career by writing young adult novels. Now you have been declared the queen of the psychological thriller by at least one outlet I know of. A viewer asks, is there any other genre that you've considered writing about other than thrillers?
Ooh, so I grew up reading mysteries and suspense, and I feel like even when I have an idea where I'm like, maybe this is something different. In the past, I've had, my kids, they're teenagers now, but I started writing when they were 1 and 3, and I was reading so much middle grade with them. And I loved the idea that like of building this world. I love reading those, but I realize that is not like my strength as a writer. And anytime I try to write something that is not like scary or mysterious, something happens within like the first 20 pages where you're like, oh, nope, it's a thriller again. So I think I'm just really drawn to this idea of mysteries, not just in a plot, but like the mysteries inside other people. And the story is very much about unwinding those secrets and mysteries that are kind of layered into the world. But I'll never say never, but I really do feel like this is my zone.
Well, I don't know how much you cook or make cocktails, but we have a question of somebody who says their book club loves to pair food and cocktails with book club recommendations and discussions. So, do you have any food or drink you would recommend for The Last to Vanish?
Oh, that's a good question. And I will admit, I am the worst cook in the world. Like, nobody wants my suggestions of like what to actually make. And I'm really bad at this question. One of my friends was reading one of my books for a book club who wanted to do the same thing. And she's like, Megan, they ate like 2 meals. That was it. Like, that's all they ate in the book.
Your characters don't eat.
I know.
S'mores, very woodsy.
Yes. I feel like this is like one of the center points of this book is this tavern. It's called the Lost and Found Tavern. And it's something that was very important 25 years ago. It was the place, or it's not the Lost and Found, sorry, the Last Stop Tavern. And it's the place where the Fraternity Four were last seen 25 years ago. And it's also a place that Abby goes all the time for answers. So I feel like tavern type food is really the right type of vibe for this book.
And Lucille asks, what drew you to wanting to be an author?
So I grew up like reading a bunch of mysteries and suspense. I loved writing, and I always said I wanted to be a writer one day. And the truth is I did not take the steps to doing that for like a decade after school, basically. I also loved science. I was like, Michael Crichton's Jurassic Park was the book that kind of like blew my mind when I was in high school of, it was all the things I loved. It was mystery and suspense and action, but also like these what if science ideas. And so I thought to myself, I'd go to school for science and I'd keep writing on the side. And the truth is I did not. I kind of went to school for biology, worked in biotech, and kind of let that side of my life go for a while. And then when I moved to North Carolina, I was a high school science teacher. And it was really when I had kids of my own that I said to myself, like, this is what I love to do. This is my passion. When am I going to take a real shot at it? And I set myself the goal of finishing something because I had kind of been like playing around every now and then. I'd have an idea and I'd get to about 20 pages when I had to figure things out, and then I'd put it aside. So I set myself the goal of finishing something. And my first books were young adult. They were set in the world of high school, and they were inspired by these what if science ideas. So I feel like all of those different paths led me to the types of stories I was telling. And even writing the young adult stories is what gave rise to my adult stories, because so much of it is about what happens in the past and how the past impacts the present.
So given your love of, science and your experience with biotech, when are we going to get the CSI style, like thriller from Megan Miranda?
I know, every once in a while. I mean, I love watching those types of shows, and I love reading those types of books as well. And, maybe one day, but I really love following the path of characters who are not people who you would think are at the center of a mystery or a murder investigation necessarily. So, they're not the detectives, they're not the people doing the science, but they're somebody who finds themselves wrapped up in that world for one reason or another, and kind of has to use their own perspective. And they're the people who really know these people that these events are happening to. And that's really what I'm most drawn to.
A viewer is also curious about your writing process. Do you write a certain amount of words every day? And how long does it take you to kind of, from start to finish, put a whole novel together?
Yeah, so I always used to say like about 9 months to a year to get a novel together. And for this book in particular, I actually can map the start date and the end date because when I was on that walk that I mentioned that kind of gave rise to this book, I took a picture with my phone and I posted it to Instagram right then and talked about like the spark of a new idea. And it was like, I don't remember exactly the date, but if I look back, it was October, like mid-October. And I turned the book in the day my new book had just come out. So it really was about like 8.5-ish months from start to finish of a first draft. That's not to say the book is done at that point. There's usually several rounds of revision. And it's not always the same for every book because sometimes it's about finding the right way to tell a story. And sometimes I don't get that right the first time. So for instance, The Last House Guest which was my 10th book. And at this point I was like, I got my process down. I know how to write a book. That took me an extra year longer than I thought it would. I wrote like 4 complete drafts, finding out like what's the heart of this story and what's the right way to tell it. I'm very interested in structure. So because of that, it can vary a little bit, but my goal is 9 months. I don't set myself word count goals usually because I'm not a plotter. And so sometimes the answer is not to just keep going. Sometimes the answer and progress is realizing the turn I took the last chapter isn't the right direction for this book. And progress is sometimes just realizing that and deleting and like seeing that negative word count. But I think of every day as just getting you closer to your finished product, and every draft gets you closer as well. So I mark my work in like time, and I am a very structured writer. When my kids were little, I wrote at night. I don't know how I used to do that because now I'm like in bed at 9 p.m. But now I write, very much during school hours. I'm in my office pretty much the whole school day. And then I close that door at the end of the day and try to compartmentalize these different parts of my life. And I'm not necessarily writing the whole time, but I'm either researching or doing something related to the, furthering the story.
One of the themes that really comes back in your books a lot is that sense, the theme of belonging. And, is that something that you consciously try to put in there, or like that insider outsider, perspective?
Yeah, sometimes it's conscious and sometimes it's not. And so I feel like it is a theme I keep coming back to over and over. And I feel like themes are also questions to explore, and it's like a different way to do it in every story. I love the tension involved in the insider versus outsider perspective. I think there's elements of tension between groups of people who are insiders or outsiders, but also within a character, and that kind of draw or wanting to belong. And I also think a lot about, and maybe this is something mirrored in my own life, that I grew up in one place. I've spent my adulthood in a different place. I've been in North Carolina for 18 years now, and looking back, kind of figuring out what makes a place home, and when that transition happens of when you start saying like, I'm going home, and meaning one place versus another. And so I think all of my characters are dealing with that in one way or another, either, choosing to stay in a place, choosing to move to a place, and what are the reasons that are keeping someone or not. And Abby, the narrator of this book, did not grow up in the town of Cutter's Pass, but she's lived there for 10 years and she sees it as her home. And yet she's not quite fully accepted as a full insider, as someone whose, parents have not lived there for generations. But it gives her a very unique perspective because she can see both those sides. She's not quite a tourist. Like, she sees all the kind of inner workings, but she's also able to see it from a remove of, I haven't been here my whole life.
And speaking of characters like Abby and the other people that populate the inn, the tavern, all of the mysterious characters of Cutter's Pass, do you draw any inspiration for these characters on people you've met, real life, true crime situations, anything like that that you draw inspiration for your characters?
I really try not to draw on any real people that I know, also because like everyone in a thriller is a suspect and also is like hiding something, even if they're not the one who did it. So I really like that. For me is the fun, is kind of crafting who these characters are. And I feel like they develop almost like the plot and the character almost develop in opposition to one another, because you're realizing what each character is afraid of, and not just, like spiders but like the things they're afraid of people knowing even about the past. And then the plot kind of almost like, these are the things they have to overcome to get to the other side and get through. And so for me also, like, I try not to name characters based on anyone I know, but like that's getting hard sometimes and I forget about it. So like, I try not to name anyone after people in my family, and inevitably the book comes out and within 2 days I get a text from someone in my family who's like, so funny, you named this character my name. And I'm like, oh no. Because I have a very large family, lots of cousins, but it's fun to kind of, I think it's always been fun to find names in there. But I always say, like, they're not based on anyone I know.
So just a reminder to the viewers that we are doing the giveaway of a 3 finished books for people who have leave a question or comment. And we've been getting a lot of questions. One that I have, actually, it's a 2-part question. We had a question from a viewer who wants to know, like, what's a really fun book that you've read that you can't stop talking about? And then the second thing is the question I'm curious about, which is what you're working on now.
Okay, yes. So I turned in a book a few weeks ago, and so I feel like I've been catching up on all of my summer reading since then. But I have been like simultaneously reading Janelle Brown's "I'll Be You," which I'm loving. It's about twins who were child actresses a long time ago and have since drifted apart in adulthood, and then one of them goes missing, and there's this angle of, you know, cults as well. Like there's so many different things that are interesting. And then I'm also bought myself on tour 2 books I'm very excited about, which is Jennifer Hillier's new one, Things We Do in the Dark, and then Julie Clark's The Lies I Tell. And I just started this and I'm loving The Lies I Tell. It's like a con artist book with 2 women, 2 different points of view. So I'd recommend all of those. And also Riley Sager's The House Across the Lake, which is such a great atmospheric thriller. So yeah, I could keep going with books I love and I'm loving. And then what I'm working on right now. So I just turned in a new book. It's still a first draft, so I don't want to say too much about it because things can change dramatically in drafts to come. But I always joke with my editor that I either set books in woods or the water, and this one we're going back to the water. So it's set in the Outer Banks, and it is, what I will say is it's about a group of people who get together for a reunion every year to mark something that has happened in their past. And then things go terribly wrong because it's a thriller.
Well, we're all very excited about your newest book, but speaking of new work from you, Deborah asks, would you ever consider writing a sequel to one of your books? And if so, which one would you write a sequel for?
That's a great question. I usually say, like, I'm drawn to standalones and I like to just leave it at a standalone because once you get your main characters to the end, I feel like, okay, they've gone through all these things and I like to imagine that they're going to be okay. And then if you put them back in a thriller, like they're not going to be okay. Like something has to go terribly wrong in their life again to put them in a sequel. And since I don't write from the perspective of like a detective, it's not like they're following necessarily an outside case. It's really about what's happening in their own homes or lives. That's not to say, I'll never say never, because my very first book, I said I wasn't going to do a sequel. And then I wrote a companion to it 2 years later, and I did it from a different character's point of view. So I felt like you could still see the characters, but you were getting a new perspective and a new journey of a different character kind of going through something different. There are stories that I think about like years later. So I think, you know, All the Missing Girls is one. That's my first book for adults. And I spent a lot of time working on that kind of by myself and no one knew about it. So it was a story that lived in my head for a very long time. And I think about those characters still sometimes. So, you know, I'll never say never, but also like I like to imagine they're all doing okay. So I don't necessarily want to put them back in a sequel.
They only need so many murders in their lifetime,
Yes.
right?
Yes. Exactly.
So we have, we're at time, and we have one last question. It comes from Kathy, who's asked, do your children know you're an author and do they think it's cool?
They do know I'm an author. And I actually, you know, it's something that I don't think they ever knew a time I wasn't an author. So I started writing when they were 1 and 3. They were with me when I got my first book deal. They were with me at so many of like the high points of the journey and have seen like the struggles, but also the successes along the way. They came with me on tour for the last house guest for part of it. So, you know, they're a huge part of this life for me as well. So yeah, it's, and they're huge readers. So it's so much fun for all of us. Yeah.
It's great. Oh, think Colleen is trying to tell us that
So
we're
sorry.
times.
I'm unmuted. I'm muted. Technical issues. You'd think after a couple months I would have had this down by now. But I'm sorry to barge in. I just wanted to thank you so much for an amazing discussion. And before we go, I just want to give one last reminder that you can still post a question in the comment section and be entered to win a copy of The Last to Vanish. Our next book club favorites pick will be Candice Carty-Williams' new novel, People Person. You can join our Facebook group or follow us on Instagram for the latest updates. And you can keep up with Megan by following her on Facebook and Instagram and visiting meganmiranda.com. Finally, Claire, Brianna, and Megan, thank you so much for joining us. I hope everyone has a lovely afternoon, and thank you guys so much.
Thank you so much. This was so lovely.
Bye, guys.